The stagecoach pulled into Elkhorn Ridge on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1874, trailing dust and the smell of horses that had been ridden too long and fed too little. The sky above Montana Territory stretched white and blue, and indifferent, the kind of sky that made a person feel both free and utterly alone depending on which side of luck they happened to be standing on. Eliza Winslow stepped down from the coach on legs that had forgotten how to hold still. 3 weeks she had been traveling, 3 weeks of rutted roads, broken axles, way stations that smelled of grease and tobacco, and fellow passengers who looked at a young woman traveling alone the way dogs look at unguarded meat. She carried one leather valise scuffed at the corners and held together more by stubbornness than stitching. In her other hand, she held a letter folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn through the ink, fading at the edges, where her thumbs had rubbed the words smooth. The letter was from a man named Harlan Colton, a rancher. 38 years old, he had written. Honest, hard-working, owner of 500 acres in a valley with good water and better soil. He was looking for a wife, and he had placed an advertisement in the Montana Post that read, simply, Rancher 38 seeks wife. Have house, land, water. Need a woman of courage who does not fear labor or solitude. Eliza had answered that advertisement the same day she read it, sitting in a boarding house room in Boston with a bruise on her wrist and nowhere left to go. She had been a governess for the Aldrich family for 2 years, teaching their 3 children Latin and arithmetic and penmanship, sleeping in a narrow room on the 3rd floor, eating meals alone in the kitchen because she was not quite a servant and not quite a guest, and therefore belonged nowhere. It had been a tolerable life, the kind of life an orphan learns to accept until the evening mister. Aldrich cornered her in the library while his wife attended a charity dinner downtown. He had grabbed her wrist and pressed her against the bookshelf, his breath heavy with port wine, and said words she would never repeat to another living soul. She had reached behind her with her free hand and closed her fingers around the brass candlestick on the shelf and swung it into his temple with every ounce of strength her small frame possessed. He had gone down like a felled tree. She had packed her valise and walked out the front door and never gone back. No references, no savings beyond $11.60. No family because she had never had family. She had grown up in the Hargrove home for orphan girls in South Boston, where she learned 3 things that stuck. Reading is freedom, silence is survival, and nobody comes to save you unless they want something in return. Harlan Colton's advertisement had been a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She wrote to him with honest words. I am 21. I am educated. I am alone in the world, and I am not afraid of hard work. He had written back warm and practical, no false promises. He did not write about love. He wrote about land, about morning light on mountain peaks, about needing someone to build a future alongside. They exchanged 4 letters. With the 4th, he sent money for a stagecoach ticket. And now she was here standing in the dust of a town she had never seen, in a territory she had never visited, looking for a man she had never met. And nobody was there to meet her. Elkhorn Ridge was a town built for function rather than beauty. One main street of packed dirt, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a courthouse that sat at the end of the street like a period at the end of a sentence. Men moved along the boardwalks, rough men with sunburned faces who looked at Eliza the way frontier men always looked at a young woman in a white silk dress stepping off a stagecoach alone. Some with curiosity, some with hunger, none with welcome. She asked at the general store. A woman behind the counter, tall and sharp-eyed, with her hair pinned in a severe bun, looked Eliza over from the dust on her hem to the locket at her throat. I am looking for Harlan Colton, Eliza said. He owns a ranch north of town. He was expecting me. The woman's expression changed, not dramatically the way a face changes in a stage play. Subtly the way weather changes on a mountain, a shift in the light, a cooling of the air. You are the mail-order bride, the woman said. It was not a question. I am Eliza Winslow. Harlan and I have been corresponding. He sent for me. The woman set down the bolt of fabric she had been measuring and came around the counter. Her name, Eliza would learn, was Margaret Crenshaw. She owned the general store. She knew every piece of gossip in Elkhorn Ridge within hours of it happening, and she delivered bad news with the efficiency of a surgeon cutting away dead flesh. Sit down, child. I would rather stand. Sit down. Eliza sat. Harlan Colton died 3 weeks ago. His horse came back without him. Search party found his body at the bottom of a ravine on the mountain road. They say the horse spooked. They say it was an accident. The world did not collapse. It did not shatter or crumble or any of the dramatic things that stories say happen when a life falls apart. It simply stopped, like a clock that is wound down. One moment Eliza had a destination, a purpose, a thin and fragile thread of hope, connecting her to a future. The next moment, the thread was cut, and she was holding nothing. She sat in Margaret Crenshaw's general store, still holding her valise, still holding the letter, and tried to understand what this meant. No husband, no home, no money for a return ticket, and a town full of strangers who had no reason to help and every reason to look away. Margaret watched her, and there was something in the older woman's eyes that might have been sympathy if it were not so thoroughly mixed with calculation. You have people back east? No. Money? No. Skills? A trade? I can read, I can write, I can do arithmetic, I can teach. This is not Boston. Nobody here is hiring a governess. Margaret leaned closer, her voice dropping. Listen to me. There is a man in this town named Silas Pendleton. He owns the silver mine north of here and half the land in the county. He showed up at Harlan's funeral with an offer to buy the ranch before the dirt was settled on the grave. He has been buying up every piece of property in this valley for 3 years, and the people who refuse to sell have a way of meeting unfortunate ends. Get on the next coach and go somewhere, anywhere. Do not let Silas Pendleton know you exist. Eliza looked at the woman. She heard the warning. She understood it. And she made a decision that was either the bravest or the most foolish of her life. Harlan Colton sent for me, she said quietly. He wrote me a letter that said this land is everything I have. He asked me to come. I came. I did not travel 2,000 miles to turn around because a rich man wants what is not his. Child, you do not understand what you are walking into. I understand exactly what I am walking into. I have been walking into rooms where I do not belong my entire life. At least this time there is land under my feet. She stood, picked up her valise, and walked out into the Montana sunlight, leaving Margaret Crenshaw staring after her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and the certainty that she was watching a young woman march toward her own destruction. The summons came the next morning. A deputy with a badge that needed polishing and a horse that needed feeding knocked on the door of the boarding house where Eliza had spent the night and informed her that Judge Orville Harwick required her presence at the courthouse at 10 o'clock to discuss the matter of the Colton estate. Eliza put on her white silk dress, the only good dress she owned, brushed the road dust from the hem as best as she could, pinned her golden hair back from her face, and walked to the courthouse with her chin lifted and her hands steady and her heart hammering so hard against her ribs she was certain the whole town could hear it. The courtroom was small and smelled of old wood and the particular mustiness of a room where justice had been bent so many times it no longer held its original shape. Wooden benches lined both sides filled with townspeople who had come to watch the way people come to watch a hanging. Judge Harwick sat behind his bench like a toad on a lily pad, round and moist and deeply uncomfortable. He was 62 years old and had the face of a man who had sold his conscience so long ago he no longer remembered what it felt like to have one. His eyes were small and quick, and they did not meet Eliza's when she entered. Silas Pendleton sat in the front row. He was 52, silver-haired, straight-backed, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. His suit was black and impeccably tailored. His face was handsome, and a hard-way jaw, square eyes the color of slate. Those eyes held intelligence, authority, and something that looked almost like righteousness, and that was the most dangerous thing about Silas Pendleton. He did not believe he was a villain. He believed he was building an empire, and anyone who stood in his way was simply an obstacle to be removed. Miss Winslow, Judge Harwick began mopping his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better days. This court has been made aware that the late Harlan Colton entered into a mail-order marriage agreement with you prior to his death. Is this correct? It is. The agreement, being a pre-matrimonial contract, affords you certain inheritance rights to the Colton property. However, he paused the way men pause when they are about to deliver a verdict they have already been paid to deliver. Under territorial law, an unmarried woman cannot maintain sole ownership of property exceeding 100 acres. Without a husband to serve as legal guarantor, you have 30 days from today to either secure a marriage or forfeit the property to the county. And the county, Eliza said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade of winter wind, will sell it to whomever the county sees fit. Judge Harwick's small eyes blinked. The court will follow proper procedure. The court will sell my land to Mr. Pendleton before the ink is dry on the forfeiture papers, and everyone in this room knows it. Whispers erupted. Someone coughed. Someone else said, "Lord have mercy," under their breath. Silas Pendleton stood. He moved the way a man moves when he knows every room he enters belongs to him. Slowly, deliberately, with the confidence of absolute control. "Your Honor, if I may." His voice was deep and measured a colonel's voice. "Miss Winslow is clearly distressed. She has traveled a great distance only to receive terrible news, which is why I would like to offer a practical solution." He turned to Eliza. "I am prepared to purchase the Colton Ranch at fair market value. You would receive a generous sum, more than enough to return east. No one needs to lose here." Dignity. Eliza tasted the word like spoiled meat. "Harlan Colton wrote to me 4 times. In his last letter, he wrote something I will never forget. He wrote, 'Eliza, this land is everything I have. If anything happens to me, do not let anyone take it.' He knew Mr. Pendleton. He knew someone wanted him dead." The courtroom went silent, not quiet silent, the kind of silence that has weight and pressure and makes it hard to breathe. Silas Pendleton's smile did not waver, but something behind it shifted. A recalculation, a reassessment of the woman standing before him. "That is a dangerous accusation, Miss Winslow." "It is not an accusation. It is a dead man's words." Judge Harwick slammed his gavel. "That is enough. Miss Winslow, the law is clear. You have 30 days to find a husband, or the property reverts to the county. Mr. Pendleton's offer stands. I strongly suggest you consider it." He raised the gavel to slam it again, to bring this farce to its predetermined conclusion, to wrap it up neatly with the kind of finality that money buys in frontier courtrooms. The door opened. Not slammed, not kicked in. Opened, wide and deliberate, the way a man opens a door when both his hands are occupied and he uses his shoulder instead, pushing it back against the wall with the casual force of someone who has walked through harder doors than this. 3 men stepped inside. The first was the tallest, 6 feet and 5 or 6 inches broad through the shoulders, his face carved granite with a scar running from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone. His hair was dark chestnut, his eyes the color of whiskey held to firelight, sharp and cold enough to make every person in that courtroom lean back without knowing they had done it. A gun belt hung low on his hip, the holster worn smooth from use. The second man was nearly as tall, but built wider, heavier, with auburn hair that caught the courtroom light and eyes that burned like embers. His face held a smile that was not friendly. 2 pistols hung at his hips, and his right hand rested on the grip of one with the relaxed familiarity of a pianist resting fingers on keys. The third man entered last. Younger, with lighter brown hair, streaked gold by sun, and warm eyes that held none of his brother's coldness. He carried a pack that smelled of dried herbs and no visible weapon, but his hands were scarred and calloused, and large enough to cause damage if required. 3 men, same impossible height, same jaw, same cheekbones, same look of men who had been forged in a place where only the hard survived. Brothers. That much was obvious. Identical, no, but cut from the same stone atone. The courtroom held its breath. "Court is in session." Judge Harwick sputtered, his face going the color of raw beef. "You cannot simply walk in here and disrupt official proceedings." The first man did not look at the judge. He looked at Eliza. His eyes found hers across the room, and something passed between them that neither could name a recognition, not of faces, but of souls that had been surviving alone for too long. "She needs a husband to keep her land," he said. His voice was low and rough, the sound of gravel scraping against hardwood. "I am offering." The courtroom erupted. Silas Pendleton rose to his full height, and for the first time his composure cracked. "Gideon Mercer." He spoke the name like it was a curse. "You and your brothers have no standing here. You are criminals. You are animals. You live in the mountains like savages, and you have no right to interfere in legal proceedings." "We are citizens of Montana Territory," the third brother said, his voice calmer than the storm around him. "Free men, no outstanding warrants. I checked. There is no law preventing any of us from entering into a marriage contract." Silas's lawyer, a thin man with spectacles and fingers stained with ink, began flipping through papers with increasing desperation. Pages turned, statutes were consulted, precedents were searched, and the answer he found was the answer he did not want to find. "There is no prohibition," the lawyer said quietly. "Marriage is a civil contract. Criminal history does not invalidate eligibility." "This is absurd," Silas said, his voice rising for the first time. "Gideon Mercer killed 3 men at Copper Creek. He is a known murderer. I killed 3 men who cut my mother's throat in front of my brothers." Gideon still did not look at Silas, still looked only at Eliza. His voice did not rise, did not waver, did not carry anything except the flat, factual weight of truth spoken without apology. "I was 15 years old. I did not have a gun. I used what I could find. If you call that murder, I will take the word. But it does not change the law, and the law says she can marry and keep her land." Eliza stood in the center of that courtroom, the center of that storm, and felt every eye on her like physical weight pressing against her chest. She looked at Gideon Mercer, at the scar, at the gun, at the eyes that had seen things no 15-year-old should ever see. She looked at his brothers, the dangerous one, with 2 guns, and the warm one with herbs on his back. She looked at 3 men who the entire territory called monsters. Then she looked at Silas Pendleton, at the perfect suit, at the calculating eyes, at the hands that had probably signed the order to kill the man who had offered her a home. And she thought, between a man who admits what he has done and a man who hides what he has done, I know which one I trust. "I consent," she said. 2 words. They rang through the courtroom like a bell struck in an empty church. Judge Harwick looked like a man being forced to swallow his own medicine. His face went through several colors, none of them healthy, before settling on a mottled purple that suggested his heart was working harder than it had in years. "This is highly irregular." "It is legal," the third brother said. "Perform the ceremony or explain to the territorial governor why you refuse to uphold a lawful marriage." The gavel came down. The words were spoken fast, as though speed could diminish their significance. Eliza Winslow and Gideon Mercer joined in matrimony by the authority of Montana Territory. Witnesses signed, papers were filed, and just like that, the orphan from Boston was married to a man she had known for less than 10 minutes. The second brother, the one with 2 guns and the dangerous smile, leaned against the wall and watched the proceedings with the expression of someone observing a chess game whose outcome he had already predicted. The third brother watched Eliza, not with calculation or hunger, or any of the things she had learned to recognize and fear in men's eyes, with something else. Curiosity, maybe, or wonder. The way a person watches a bird land on a branch that should not hold its weight, and it holds. Silas Pendleton stopped in front of Eliza as the courtroom emptied. His voice was low enough that only she could hear. "You think 3 mountain savages can protect you?" Harlan Colton thought he was safe too. "Look where he is now." "Are you confessing, Mr. Pendleton?" Something flickered in those slate-gray eyes. Not fear, assessment. This girl was not what he had expected. "Be careful, Miss Winslow. Montana kills people in many ways." "It is Mrs. Mercer now," Eliza said, "and I am not the one who should be careful." He walked away. His boots made no sound on the wooden floor, which told Eliza everything she needed to know about a man who had learned to move through the world without leaving traces. The ride from town to the ranch took 4 hours on a mountain road that climbed through pine forest and meadow. Eliza drove the wagon. Gideon rode ahead on a gray horse scarred from years of hard use. Boone rode to the left, scanning the tree line in a constant sweep. Callum rode closest to the wagon, glancing at her occasionally. Nobody spoke for the first hour. Callum broke the silence. "You must be hungry. 3 weeks on the road. Way station food is the worst thing about the West, and that is saying something because the West includes grizzly bears and dysentery." Eliza almost smiled. "Almost. I am fine." "You are not fine, but you are used to saying that. Am I right?" She looked at him. He smiled, open and genuine. The kind of smile that made you want to trust it, even when every instinct said trust was a luxury you could not afford. "When we get to the ranch, I will make coffee. It is the one thing I do well. Do not ask about my cooking." "Why are you doing this?" Eliza said. "All 3 of you, walking into that courtroom, marrying a stranger, bringing me to a ranch that belonged to a dead man you claim to have known. Why? Silence, then Gideon's voice from ahead without turning. Harlan fed us through the winter of 71. Snow came early that year. We lost half our cattle. Nobody in town would sell provisions to the Mercer brothers. Reputation follows you in a small territory. Harlan was the only one who opened his door, fed us, asked no questions, took no payment. So this is repaying a debt. This is doing what is right. Harlan did right by us. Now we do right by his widow. I am not his widow. I never met him. But you traveled 2,000 miles because he asked you to. That tells me what kind of person you are. Eliza turned to Boone. He had not spoken since leaving the courthouse, had not looked at her, had not acknowledged her existence beyond riding in a position that happened to put him between her and any threat that might come from the western tree line. And you, she asked, do you also believe that this is the right thing? Boone looked at her. His eyes held none of the warmth she had seen in Callum's, none of the guarded depth she sensed in Gideon's. They held something hard and uncompromising, like a locked door. I think this is trouble, he said flatly. But Gideon decided, and I follow Gideon. Honest, direct, no pretense. Eliza decided she could work with that. The ranch appeared as they crested a final ridge, and Eliza's breath caught despite everything. The valley opened below them like a cupped hand ringed by snow-capped mountains. Harlan's house sat in the center, a two-story log structure with a wraparound porch. A barn stood behind it, and fences stretched across the meadow like seams in a quilt. It was beautiful, and it was falling apart. 6 months without a living hand had done what 6 months always does. Fences sagged. The barn listed. The roof showed gaps. Weeds had claimed everything. Gideon dismounted and stood for a long moment, his eyes moving across the property with the slow, methodical assessment of a man who sees not what is, but what needs to be done to make it what it should be. Fences need resetting. Barn needs squaring. Roof needs patching. Well needs clearing. He said it the way another man might read a grocery list. No emotion, just facts. I know it is in bad shape, Eliza said, her voice carrying a defensive edge she did not entirely intend, but it is mine. Nobody said it was not yours. Gideon looked at her the first time he had looked directly at her since the courtroom. Those eyes, so cold from a distance, held something different up close. Not warmth exactly, but depth. The suggestion of warmth buried so far down it might take years to reach. You sleep in the house, he said. We sleep in the barn. The barn? We have slept in worse places. Boone said, already dismounting and heading for the barn with the purposeful stride of a man who intends to start working immediately and does not care whether anyone joins him. Do not worry about us. Callum smiled again, that disarming, open smile. Barn is fine as long as it has a roof. Tomorrow, I fix the roof first. They worked until dark, all three of them, without being asked, without discussion. Gideon began on the fences with a precision that bordered on artistry, each post straight, each nail sunk in 3 clean strikes. He was a carpenter by nature. Boone attacked the gate with brute effectiveness. Callum patched the barn roof with careful deliberation, measuring twice, cutting once. She made supper. Eggs, bread, coffee, strong enough to strip varnish. She set the table on the porch, unsure whether the brothers would come inside to eat or whether she should bring food to the barn. Callum appeared first, hands washed, smile in place. I smelled coffee from across the ridge, he said, sitting down with the grateful exhaustion of a man who has earned his meal. Lord, someone cooked for me. Last time that happened, was when Mama was alive. He stopped. His face shifted a cloud-crossing sun. I am sorry, I did not mean to bring that up. Do not apologize, Eliza said. Tell me about her. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her, carefully, briefly. Their mother's name was Sarah. She was a schoolteacher before she married their father. She read to them every night, made apple pie on Sundays, sang while she did the wash. She died when Callum was 10. Boone appeared at the door midway through the story. He heard half a sentence and his face hardened into something that looked like stone, but was actually the opposite, something so fragile it needed stone to protect it. He sat down, ate in silence, and when Callum finished, Boone stood and gave Eliza a short nod. Not polite, not friendly. Acknowledgement. The nod of a man who has registered that someone listened to his brother's pain and did not flinch from it. Then he walked back to the barn. Gideon came last. He always arrived after his brothers had eaten, always choosing the seat farthest from the center, always positioning himself where he could see the yard through the window. One evening, 2 weeks into their arrangement, Eliza set down the serving spoon and looked at him directly. "How many times do I have to tell you to come in before you stop hovering out there?" "Old habit." "What habit?" "Waiting to be told I am welcome somewhere." The words landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Eliza felt the ripples move through her chest. She pulled out his chair, the one that faced the window because she had noticed he always positioned himself where he could see outside, and said, "This is your chair. It will always be your chair. You do not need an invitation to sit in it." Gideon sat, he ate, and that night for the first time he did not eat like a man feeling himself for labor. He ate slowly. He tasted the food. He looked at the plate and the table and the kitchen and the woman across from him, and something in his granite expression shifted by a degree so small that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed. Eliza noticed. "Harlan would have liked you," he said, the first non-essential sentence he had spoken to her outside of work. "You think so, know so. He was a good man, deserved a good person beside him. And do you not deserve the same?" He did not answer. He stood, nodded, and walked out into the darkness. Eliza watched him go and felt the ache of a door closing that had been open for exactly 1 second. That night, lying in Harlan Colton's bed in Harlan Colton's house in a territory she had never seen before today, Eliza stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind howl through gaps in the walls and tried to comprehend what had happened to her life. This morning she was a mail-order bride arriving to meet a husband. Tonight she was married to a stranger, a man whose name made an entire town go quiet, and his two brothers had come as part of the arrangement, like items she had not ordered but could not return. Around midnight she heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. She went to the window. Gideon walked the fence line, one hand resting on his gun, circling the property again and again. He was keeping watch. On the third night, Eliza could not sleep. She sat by the window and discovered the full extent of their vigilance. Gideon walked the north perimeter. Boone sat on a rock outcropping above the barn, still as a carved figure, watching the entire valley. And Callum lay on the barn roof, not watching but listening, reading the sounds of the forest, the way a blind man reads a face with his fingertips. 3 centuries, 3 brothers, guarding a woman they had known for 72 hours. A week into the arrangement, on a night when sleep would not come, and the mountain wind carried every sound from the barn to the house, she heard them arguing. Boone's voice came first, sharp and frustrated. "It has been a week, Gideon. She is in the house, we are in the barn, we are fixing fences for a dead man. How long does this go on?" "As long as it needs to." That is not an answer. Why, Harlan was good to us, agreed. We repaid the debt, walked into court, married the girl, saved the land. Done. Now what? We stay here forever, fix fences forever, cook meals forever. Callum's voice, the peacemaker. "Do you want to leave?" "I want to know the plan." Gideon always has a plan, but this time, he walked into that courtroom and looked at that girl and decided in 2 seconds flat. No plan, no calculation. First time in his life, he did something with his gut instead of his head. And I want to know why. Silence, long enough that Eliza pressed her ear against the wall, afraid she had missed the answer. Then Gideon, barely above a whisper, "Because..." I looked at her, standing alone in that courtroom, and I thought of Mama. Mama standing alone in that kitchen when they came. Nobody helped her. Nobody walked through that door. I swore after that night that if I could stop it from happening to anyone, I would stop it. Boone, that is a reason, not a plan. Gideon, sometimes a reason is enough. Long silence. Then Boone, "She is going to bring trouble. Silas will not stop. You know that?" "I know." "And you are staying?" "I am staying." "Then I am staying too. But when Silas comes, I handle it my way, not yours. Your way is shoot first and ask questions never. And my way works." "Callum, good Lord, can you two go one single night without arguing?" Eliza sank back from the wall, her heart beating in a rhythm she did not recognize. These men, these brothers who the world had labeled killers and outcasts and monsters, were arguing about her, about whether to stay, about duty and debt and the memory of a mother who had been murdered. And the reason they were here, the real reason, underneath all the practicality and obligation, was that Gideon Mercer had looked at a woman standing alone against forces she could not defeat and had refused to let it happen again. She went to the general store the following week. The town treated her like a woman carrying plague. Margaret Crenshaw served her quickly, eyes darting to the door. Mrs. Henderson, wife of the feed store owner, crossed the street with her daughter when she saw Eliza coming. The blacksmith, an old man named Waller, who was the only person in Elkhorn Ridge willing to do business with the Mercer brothers, leaned close and whispered, "Watch your back, Mrs. Mercer. Silas Pendleton does not lose gracefully." Margaret Crenshaw came to the ranch 2 days later with her daughters Beth and Jane. "The entire town is talking," Margaret said. "They say you were coerced. I stood in a courtroom and said I consent. Nobody forced me. Gideon Mercer killed 3 men with his bare hands, Eliza. 3 men who murdered his mother. He was 15 years old. If someone killed your mother in front of your daughters, Margaret, what would you do?" "Silence," Jane, the 17-year-old, whispered to Beth. "She is fierce." They left. Eliza stood in the yard and realized she had just defended 3 men she had known for 10 days. The barn door opened. Gideon stepped out. He had heard everything through the thin walls. "You did not need to do that," he said. "I did not defend you. I stated facts. To outsiders, there is no difference. I do not care what outsiders think." Something moved across his face. Not a smile, but the place where a smile would be if he remembered how. He went back to the barn. Eliza watched him go and felt something shift in her chest, in a tectonic movement, small but irreversible. She was not falling in love. She was too practical for that. But she was falling into something. Trust, maybe. Or the beginning of trust. That night she stood at the window one last time before sleep. 3 figures moved through the darkness, each keeping watch, in his own way, guarding a woman they had known for days. And Eliza Winslow, the orphan girl from Boston, who had never been protected by anyone in 21 years of living, began to understand that perhaps Harlan Colton had not died in vain. Perhaps his letter had brought her not to him, but to the place she was always meant to be. Not to one man, but to 3 brothers who needed her as much as she needed them. Only none of the 4 of them knew how to say it. Not yet. And in the high mountains of Montana, where the wind never stopped and the stars burned close enough to touch, that was all right. Some truths do not need words. They need time. And fences that get fixed before dawn. And coffee shared in silence. And the slow, stubborn, terrifying act of learning to trust someone with the only thing you have left, which is yourself. 2 weeks passed, and the ranch began to remember what it was supposed to be. The brothers worked with a devotion that bordered on sacrament, each in his own way. Gideon rebuilt the fences with a carpenter's precision, each post plumb straight, each joint so tight, Eliza could not fit a fingernail between board and post. She watched him through the kitchen window and thought that a man's character could be read in the way he built a fence, and Gideon Mercer built fences the way cathedrals are built, with patience and purpose, and the unspoken belief that what you make with your hands should outlast you. Boone attacked the gate and corral with relentless force, beating materials into submission. His work lacked elegance, but nothing he built ever moved from where he put it. Callum handled the barn roof and garden fence with careful deliberation, measuring twice, cutting once, never having to redo a single thing. Eliza found her own rhythm among theirs. She cooked, cleaned, mended, and began turning the overgrown patch behind the kitchen into a garden. Callum helped her. He knew soil the way his brother knew wood. "Plant the beans here," he said one morning, kneeling beside her in the dirt, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he turned the earth. "Soil is richer near the creek. Carrots want the higher ground where the drainage is better." "How do you know all this?" "Mama taught us. She grew everything. Said a woman who can feed herself never has to depend on anyone." He paused, a shadow crossing his open face. She was right about that. She sounds like she was right about a lot of things. She was right about most things. He smiled, but the smile carried weight. She was wrong about one thing, though. She told us the world would be fair if we were good. Turns out the world does not care whether you are good or not. It just keeps coming. Eliza looked at him, this youngest brother, with his warm eyes and his herb pack and his easy laughter that hid a grief as deep as his brother's silence. Maybe that is why being good matters, she said, because the world does not require it. You choose it anyway. Callum held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and something moved behind his eyes. That was not grief and not laughter, but something between something that made Eliza look away first. By the end of the second week, the evening meals had become something none of them had expected. A ritual, a gathering point, the 1 hour of each day when all four of them occupied the same space and breathed the same air and existed however briefly as something that resembled a family. Callum still arrived first. Boone still ate in silence. And Gideon still chose the chair by the window, the one Eliza had claimed for him, with a declaration that brooked no argument. But the silences between them had changed. They were no longer empty. They were full of things being built slowly the way fences are built one post at a time. The attack came on the 15th night. Eliza woke to hoofbeats. Not one horse or two, the thunder of 6 horses ridden hard coming up the mountain road with purpose that could not be mistaken for a social call. She rolled out of bed, grabbed Harlan's rifle from where she kept it propped against the wall, and went to the window. Moonlight flooded the yard. 6 riders circled the barn torches, burning the orange light, casting long shadows that writhed across the ground like living things. The lead rider was a man she recognized from the courtroom, thick through the shoulders, with a jaw like a shovel blade and eyes that sat too close together. Dalton Greaves, Silas Pendleton's foreman. His voice carried through the night like a hammer striking iron. "Mercer, get out here. Mr. Pendleton wants a word." The barn door opened. Not one man. 3. They emerged together, shoulder to shoulder, already dressed, already armed, and already arranged in the formation that Eliza was beginning to understand was as natural to them as breathing. Gideon in the center, still as stone, his hand resting on his holstered pistol, with the relaxed readiness of a man who has drawn that weapon so many times the motion has been worn into his muscle and bone. Boone on the left, both guns already clear of leather, not aimed but held low at his sides, in a way that said, "I am ready and I am fast, and you should think very carefully about your next 5 seconds." Callum on the right, unarmed as always, but positioned with the quiet competence of someone who has learned that the best place to be in a fight is the place nobody expects trouble from. They had been waiting for this. Eliza realized it with a cold clarity that settled over her like snow. They had known Silas would send men. They had known it was not a question of whether but when. And they had been sleeping, ready every night, boots on, guns loaded, waiting in the dark, the way soldiers wait in trenches for the whistle to blow. Eliza did not stay inside. She came through the front door with Harlan's rifle in her hands, still wearing her nightgown, her golden hair loose and wild around her shoulders. And she walked to the edge of the porch and stood there, small and fierce and lit by torchlight, like something out of a painting of frontier justice. "Go back inside, Eliza." Gideon did not turn around, but he knew she was there. He always knew. "This is my land. I will stand on my land." "Eliza, you heard me." Dalton Greaves laughed. It was an ugly sound, the laugh of a man who finds cruelty entertaining. "Boston girls got some fire. That is sweet, Mrs. Mercer. Real sweet. But here is how this works. Mr. Pendleton's offering one last time. $5,000 for the ranch. Take the money, take your mountain trash, and go." Everybody walks away happy. "No," Eliza said. "Lady, you should think about this." "I have thought about it. The answer was no yesterday. The answer will be no tomorrow. The answer is no right now, tonight, standing on this porch. Now get off my land before I let my husbands give you an answer that does not require words." "Husbands? Greaves grinned, a feral baring of teeth. "You got 3 husbands, Mrs. Mercer. Whole town knows what that means. They say you are nothing but a little." 3 hammers cocked. 3 sounds, almost simultaneous, the metallic triple click of weapons being armed by hands that had performed the action 10,000 times. "Finish that sentence," Boone said. His voice was soft, almost gentle, and that softness was the most terrifying sound Eliza had ever heard. "Please, finish it." Greaves looked at Boone's face and saw something there that drained the amusement from his own. He looked at his men, 5 riders behind him, torches guttering in the mountain wind, their horses shifting nervously because animals can smell intent, and the intent coming off the Mercer brothers was as heavy and unmistakable as the smell of blood. One of the riders, a young man barely out of his teens, spoke up. "Dalton Pendleton did not pay us enough for this, not for all 3 of them." Shut your mouth. 3 Mercer's Dalton. 3. I signed on for ranch work, not a funerum. Greaves looked at his men, then at the brothers, then at Eliza on the porch, with a rifle she clearly knew how to hold. The arithmetic was simple. 6 men against 3 brothers and a woman who had refused to stay inside. The numbers favored Greaves, but numbers do not account for the fact that Gideon Mercer had killed 3 grown men with an axe at 15 that Boone Mercer could draw and fire 2 pistols faster than most men could draw one, and that Callum Mercer, the gentle one, the healer, stood between his brothers with the calm of someone who had decided long ago that dying beside family was not the worst way to go. This is not over, Greaves said. It is, Gideon replied. Go back to Silas. Tell him this. Next time he sends boys to do a man's job, send coffins with them. Boone not to be outdone, or come himself. I would like that. I would like that very much. They left. Horses wheeling torches, trailing sparks, the sound of beats diminishing down the mountain road until the night swallowed them, and all that remained was silence and the smell of smoke and the ragged sound of 4 people breathing hard. Eliza lowered the rifle. Her arms shook. Her knees buckled. She sat down on the porch steps because standing was no longer something her body was willing to do. Callum knelt beside her, one large hand on her shoulder, his voice warm and steady. You are all right. It is over. They are gone. I am fine. Your hands are shaking. Then my hands are shaking. I am still fine. Boone walked past, heading for the perimeter, still scanning the darkness, still wired for the fight that had not quite happened. But as he passed Eliza, he stopped. He did not look at her. He looked straight ahead into the dark tree line and said in a voice stripped of its usual edge, You stood your ground. That was good. From Boone, those words were a medal of honor. Gideon came last. He stood in front of her, and she looked up at him, and the moonlight caught the scar on his face and the set of his jaw, and she saw something there that she had not seen before. Not coldness, not distance, fear. He was afraid, not of Greaves or Silas or bullets or fire. Afraid that she had been out here. Afraid that something could have happened to her while he was standing 20 feet away. You called me your husband, he said. Because you are. On paper. On paper. She held his gaze. And on this porch, and in that courtroom, and wherever else it matters. He looked at her for a long time. Then the knot in his jaw loosened, just barely, just enough. And he walked into the darkness to check the perimeter. And Eliza sat on the porch steps and pressed her hands together to stop their trembling and thought about the word husband and how it tasted different every time she said it, less like ash and more like something she might one day mean. 3 weeks after the wedding, Callum collapsed. Eliza found him face down in the yard halfway between the barn and the chicken coop, a bucket of feed spilled beside him. She dropped to her knees and pressed her hand to his forehead and jerked it back. His skin burned like a stovetop. His breathing was shallow, rapid, wrong. Gideon Boone. They came from different directions. Gideon from the north fence, Boone from the creek, where he had been checking the water flow, both running the way men run when the person calling their name is using the voice that means someone is dying. Gideon reached them first. He gathered Callum into his arms the way a man gathers a child, despite the fact that Callum was over 6 feet tall and built like a draft horse, and carried him toward the house. He did not hesitate at the door this time. He walked straight through it, carrying his youngest brother into the home he had never quite believed he was allowed to enter, and laid him on the bed in the downstairs room that Eliza had made up with clean blankets just that morning, as though some part of her had known this was coming. For 3 days the fever raged. Callum, the warmest of the brothers, the one who smiled easiest and laughed loudest and made the worst coffee Eliza had ever tasted, but somehow made drinking it feel like an act of love, lay in that bed and burned. His skin turned the color of old wax. His eyes, when they opened, saw things that were not in the room, people who were not there, conversations from years ago replaying behind his eyelids, like scenes from a play performed for an audience of ghosts. He called for his mother. That was the worst part. Not the fever itself, not the shaking, not the way his body seemed to be consuming itself from the inside. The worst part was hearing this 31-year-old man, this man who had survived 21 years on a mountain with nothing but his brothers and his courage, calling out in the dark for a woman who had been dead since he was 10. Mama, I am sorry. I am sorry I could not save you. Gideon saved us. Boone fought. I just stood there. I just stood behind the cabinet and watched. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Eliza sat beside the bed and changed the cool cloths on his forehead and poured water between his cracked lips when he was conscious enough to swallow and listened to every word and held his hand and did not cry. She did not cry because crying was a luxury for people who could afford to be weak, and Callum needed her to be strong, and so she was strong. Gideon stood in the corner of the room. He did not sit. He did not lean. He stood upright, motionless, a stone pillar in the shadows, and he did not leave. Not for 3 days. Not to eat, not to sleep, not to work, not to check the fences or walk the perimeter or do any of the 1,000 things that were his daily ritual. He stood and watched his youngest brother fight for his life, and the only sign that he was feeling anything at all was his hands. Those massive, calloused hands that had killed men and built fences and caught Eliza when she jumped from a height that should have broken her were clenched so tight that his nails cut into his palms. Eliza saw blood seep between his fingers and said nothing because she understood that this was the only way Gideon Mercer knew how to pray. Boone did not enter the room. For 3 days, while his youngest brother lay dying, Boone Mercer stayed outside. He chopped wood. He split kindling. He sharpened every blade on the property until they could cut it air. He reshod 2 horses. He mended a harness. He found things to do with his hands because if his hands stopped moving, his mind would start thinking. And if his mind started thinking, it would think about the last time he sat beside a bed where someone was burning with fever, and that had been his mother, and she had not woken up, and Boone Mercer, at 34 years old, still could not sit beside a sickbed without becoming the 11-year-old boy hiding behind a cabinet, holding his younger brother against his chest and listening to the sounds no child should ever hear. On the second night, Eliza stepped onto the porch to breathe air that did not smell of sickness. Boone was sitting on the steps, a knife in one hand and a block of wood in the other, though the wood had been whittled down to almost nothing, and what remained bore no resemblance to anything except the shape of a man's inability to process what he was feeling. "You should go in and see him," Eliza said. "No. He is your brother." "I know who he is." "Then go to him." Silence. The knife stopped moving. Boone stared at the ruined piece of wood in his hand and said in a voice that Eliza had never heard from him before, a voice without edge or heat or armor, "The last time I sat beside a bed where someone had a fever like that was Mama. She did not wake up." He did not look at her. He could not. Because looking at her would mean admitting that what he had just said was not information, but confession, and Boone Mercer did not confess. Not to anyone, not ever. Eliza sat down beside him. She did not touch him. She did not speak. She simply sat close enough that their shoulders almost touched and let the silence do what words could not. After a long time, Boone said, "You are not terrible for a Boston girl." "Thank you, I think." The ghost of something that might have been a smile crossed his face and was gone. On the third night, the fever broke. Callum opened his eyes to find Eliza asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still resting on his arm, her golden hair fallen across her face, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of 3 nights without sleep. He found Gideon, standing in the corner, eyes open, hands still clenched, a statue that had been standing guard for 72 hours without moving. And through the window, he found Boone sitting on the porch steps, head bowed, knife in hand, the picture of a man who has been holding himself together by the thinnest of threads. "What did I miss?" Callum whispered. Eliza jerked awake. Her hand tightened on his arm. Her eyes found his, and they were clear and alert and alive. And the sound that came out of her was half laugh and half sobbing, and entirely the sound of relief so profound it has no name. "Thank God. Thank God. Do not ever do that again." Callum looked at her, looked at the exhaustion on her face, the tear tracks on her cheeks, the way her fingers gripped his arm, like she was afraid he would disappear if she let go. And he said quietly, "You cried for me." "Of course I cried for you. You are my family." The word landed in the room like a pebble in still water. From the corner, Gideon's head turned. In the chair, Callum looked up at Eliza. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The word family had rearranged the air in the room, and all 4 of them breathed it in, and none of them could pretend anymore that this was a legal arrangement or a repaid debt or anything other than what it was becoming. Eliza moved them all into the house that day. She would not hear arguments, and she got them anyway, and she won them all. 3 bedrooms upstairs, she said. 3 brothers. Discussion over. Boone was the last to object and the first to carry his blanket up the stairs, which told Eliza everything she needed to know about the relationship between what Boone Mercer said and what Boone Mercer did. One evening by the fire, the 4 of them sat in a silence that had become comfortable the way a worn chair is comfortable, shaped by use and time to fit the people who occupy it. Callum was recovering, propped in the big chair closest to the heat, a blanket over his legs and color returning to his face. Gideon sat on the floor with his back against the wall, which Eliza had learned was his preferred position in any room, always with his back to something solid and his face toward the door. Boone leaned against the mantel arms, crossed, staring into the flames. Eliza told them about the orphanage, about counting days until she was old enough to leave, about Mr. Aldridge, about the candlestick and the bruise on her wrist and the $11.60 that represented the sum total of her worth in the world. She told it without self-pity, the way a person reports a weather event. These things happen. She survived them. That was all. Your turn, she said. Heavy silence, the fire cracked. Gideon told it, his voice flat, nearly toneless, like a man reading a military report about a battle that happened to someone else. Their father died when Gideon was 13. Sickness, slow and terrible. Their mother, Sarah, held the family together on that mountain with nothing but her will and her hands and a collection of books she had brought from back east. She taught them to read. She taught them to write. She taught them that a man's worth is measured not by what he takes from the world, but what he builds in it. She survived 2 winters alone, with 3 boys, no help from the town, no help from anyone because the Mercer homestead was too far up the mountain and too poor and too forgotten for anyone to bother with. Then 3 miners came, drunk, passing through. They had heard a rumor about a pretty woman living alone with children on the mountain, and they came with intentions that did not require explanation because the evidence was in the way they kicked in the door and the way they laughed when Sarah told them to leave. Gideon was in the forest checking trap lines. He heard his mother scream. He ran. 2 miles downhill through trees and rock faster than he had ever run, and when he burst through the door of their cabin, he saw his mother on the kitchen floor and 3 men standing over her and blood on the knife in one man's hand, and Boone, 11 years old, pressed into the corner, holding Callum against his chest, Callum's face buried in his brother's shirt so he would not have to see. Gideon was 15. There was no gun within reach. He grabbed his father's axe from beside the fireplace. He did not describe what happened next. He did not need to. The silence described it. The scar on his face described it. The way his hands, even now, 21 years later, tightened into fists when he spoke of it, described it. After, he said, and his voice did not waver. I washed my hands. I covered Mama with her quilt. I made soup for Boone and Callum. The next morning, I dug a grave under the oak tree behind the house. We buried her, and then we survived. Nobody asked how. Nobody came. The town only knew one thing: the Mercer boy killed 3 men. Nobody added that they killed his mother first. Eliza did not cry. She looked at Gideon and said, You saved your brothers. I was too late to save her. But you saved Boone and Callum, and you have kept them alive for 21 years. That is not failure. That is an entire life. Boone stood abruptly, walked outside. Eliza heard a single impact against the exterior wall, a fist hitting wood hard once. Then silence. Then he came back, sat down, did not look at anyone, and said, What was that song Mama used to sing, the laundry song? Callum from his chair. Barbara Allen, she sang it off key. She sure did. Boone almost smiled, almost. Worst singing voice in Montana territory. Callum laughed. It was thin and tired, the laugh of a man still recovering from a fever that nearly killed him, but it was real. Gideon did not laugh, but the granite softened. For just a moment, he did not look like a statue or a sentinel or a man carrying 21 years of guilt on shoulders broad enough to bear it. He looked like an older brother, remembering his mother's voice, and that was enough. The fire that consumed Eliza's house came 2 weeks later, on a night when the moon was full and the wind was still, and there was no reason for a house to burn except that someone had made sure it would. Eliza woke to the smell of smoke, not wood smoke, which she had grown accustomed to, but something acrid and chemical. The smell of lamp oil spread across dry timber and set alight with purpose. She opened her eyes and saw orange light pulsing under her bedroom door, and in the half-second between sleep and waking, between dreaming and understanding, she felt the heat press against the floorboards beneath her feet like the hand of something that wanted to swallow her. She threw off the blankets and ran to the door and touched it and pulled her hand back with a hiss of pain. The wood was hot. The fire was on the stairs between her and the way out, eating the house from the inside like a living thing, with an appetite that would not be satisfied until everything was ash. Gideon Boone Callum. She ran to the window, shoved it open, leaned out into the cool mountain air, and screamed their names again into the darkness. 3 voices answered, from 3 directions. They had been at their posts, Gideon walking the north fence, Boone on his rock above the barn, Callum in the garden where he sometimes sat at night surrounded by the smell of earth and growing things. And when Eliza's voice cut through the silence, all 3 brothers converged on the house at a dead run coming from 3 points of the compass like spokes of a wheel racing toward a center that was on fire. Gideon reached the house first. He stood below her window, and in the moonlight and the firelight, his face was a map of every fear he had ever felt, and most of them were new, because Gideon Mercer had spent 21 years teaching himself not to be afraid, and it had taken less than a month for this woman to teach him that there were things worse than dying, and one of them was losing someone you had not yet told that they mattered. "Jump," he said. His voice was steady, but the steadiness cost him something, and Eliza could hear the price in the slight roughness at the edges. "I will catch you. It is 15 feet, and I am here. Jump." Below, Boone arrived, assessed the situation in the time it takes a heartbeat to complete, and ran for the kitchen window on the ground floor, the one that the fire had not yet reached. He did not ask. He did not announce. He went because Boone Mercer operated on a principle so simple, it was almost elegant. If something needs doing, do it. If something is on fire, run toward it. If your family is in danger, stop thinking and start moving. Callum arrived last, breathing hard from his sprint across the yard, and positioned himself beside Gideon, hands up ready to help catch Eliza, or break her fall, or do whatever was needed. His face was white, drained of every shade of warmth that usually lived there, and his hands were shaking, but he was there. He was always there. "Eliza, jump. Now." Gideon's voice allowed no argument. She climbed onto the windowsill. Behind her, flames began licking under the bedroom door, and the wood charred and blackened, and she could feel the heat on her back like a hand pushing her toward the edge. She looked down, 15 feet to hard ground. 2 men below with their arms raised and in their faces always upturned, and their eyes saying the same thing: "We are here. We will not let you fall." She jumped. The fall was a lifetime compressed into 2 seconds. Then Gideon's arms closed around her, taking her full weight against his body, and they went down together hard, his back hitting the ground. First his body absorbing the impact so that hers did not have to. She heard something in his chest give way, a crack, the sound of a rib breaking or fracturing, a sound that should have made him cry out but did not, because Gideon Mercer did not cry out. Not at 15 when he fought 3 men with an axe. Not at 36 when he caught a woman falling from a burning house and felt his bones protest the mathematics of impact and velocity in love. He did not let go. Even on the ground, even with broken ribs screaming through his nervous system, his arms stayed locked around her until she found her footing and pulled herself up. "The papers," Eliza gasped, remembering. Harlan's documents, the metal box in the downstairs closet, the letters, the evidence, everything. "Harlan's papers are inside." Boone was already gone. He had entered through the kitchen window 30 seconds ago, and now he was somewhere inside that burning house, navigating smoke and flame and collapsing timbers with the instinct of a man who runs toward destruction the way most men run from it. "Boone," Callum's voice cracked. He held Eliza by the shoulders, partly to support her, partly to stop her from running after his brother, partly to stop himself from doing the same. His fingers dug into her arms, not from carelessness, but from the desperate need to hold on to something while his brother was inside a furnace. "Let him go," Callum whispered, and Eliza did not know if he was talking to her or to himself. "Boone is the fastest. Boone will get out." 1 minute. The roof groaned. Timbers shifted inside the deep structural complaint of a building losing its battle against gravity and heat. 2 minutes. Part of the second floor sagged inward with a sound like bones breaking. Eliza pressed against Callum's chest. Her face turned toward the house, her eyes burning from smoke and tears, and she whispered the only prayer she knew, which was not really a prayer at all, but a single word repeated. Please, please, please. Glass exploded outward from the front window. Boone came through it in a shower of shattered panes and billowing smoke. His arms wrapped around a metal box and a bundle of papers. His shirt on fire on the left sleeve, cuts from the glass, mapping red lines across his forearms and face. He hit the ground and rolled, and Callum released Eliza and sprinted to his brother and threw his jacket over the burning sleeve and beat out the flames with his hands. Eliza ran. She dropped to her knees beside Boone, and her hands went to his face before her mind caught up with her body, her fingers checking the cuts, turning his head to see the damage, searching for injuries, the way a person searches for something they cannot afford to lose. I got the papers, Boone said. His voice was rough, scraped raw by smoke, and he looked at Eliza kneeling over him, with tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face, and he looked confused by her concern, the way a stray dog looks confused when someone offers it food. I do not care about the papers, Eliza said, and her voice broke. I care that you are alive. Something in Boone Mercer broke open. Not loudly, not dramatically, not the way things break in stories. Quietly, the way ice breaks in spring, a crack that runs deep and lets the water through. I am all right, he said, and his voice shook. For the first time in the 23 years since his mother's death, his voice shook and he let someone hear it. I am all right, Eliza. She turned to Gideon. He was standing, one arm wrapped around his ribs, his face tight with pain he would never admit to, and he was looking at her. Only at her. The house was burning behind him. The house that Harlan Colton had built with his own hands, the house that was supposed to be Eliza's future, and Gideon Mercer did not spare it a glance. He looked at Eliza the way a man looks at the only light in a dark room. You are hurt, she said, going to him. It is nothing. Your rib is broken. It will heal. Gideon. She stopped in front of him and placed her hand on his chest gently above the injury, feeling his heartbeat under her palm, rapid and strong. Do not say it is nothing to me. Not ever. I need you to be honest with me. He looked down at her hand on his chest, then at her face and the wall he had maintained for 21 years, the wall that kept everyone at arm's length and emotion at bay. Invulnerability, locked in a vault that had no key, developed a crack. It hurts, he said, one word of truth, the most vulnerable thing he had ever said to another person. Good, Eliza said. Now let me wrap it. They stood in the yard and watched the house burn. 4 people. Gideon with his broken ribs wrapped in strips torn from Eliza's nightgown. Boone with glass cuts and singed hair in a metal box at his feet. Callum with soot on his face and tears on his cheeks that he did not bother to hide. Eliza in the center holding Gideon's hand on one side and Callum's on the other. Boone standing behind her closer than he had ever stood to anyone. The roof collapsed with a sound like thunder, and sparks spiraled upward into the night sky like 1,000 orange stars being born and dying in the same breath. Everything Harlan Colton had built, everything Eliza had hoped for when she stepped off that stagecoach 3 weeks ago, turned to ash and ember and memory. We rebuild, Eliza said. Build what did Callum asked? A house, our house, not Harlan's, not anyone else's, ours, the 4 of us. Gideon looked at her. You are certain. I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Boone from behind her, his voice low and rough and stripped bare. Then we build. In the morning in the barn that was now their home, they opened the metal box. Harlan Colton's handwriting was neat and deliberate, the penmanship of a man who wrote carefully because he knew his words might be all that survived him. The letters were dated, witnessed, and devastating. Eliza read aloud, Silas Pendleton approached me today with a 3rd offer for the ranch. I refused. He said these words and I write them exactly as he spoke them. Accidents happen in the mountains, Colton. Horses lose their footing. Men fall. I am writing this letter so that if something happens to me, Eliza will know. It was not an accident. She turned the page. The next letter was dated 2 weeks before Harlan's death. I have discovered why Silas wants this land. It is not the grass or the grazing, it is the water. The creek that runs through my property is fed by an underground spring, the largest in the county. Whoever controls that spring controls every ranch within 30 miles. Silas has already purchased 7 surrounding properties. Mine is the last piece. I have hidden the original deed in the bank vault under Eliza's name. The ledger was worse. Page after page in Harlan's steady hand documenting a pattern of death and acquisition that stretched back 3 years. 14 names, 14 deaths, Jacob Brennick thrown from a horse, the Prescott's house fire, Michael Rawlings shot by supposed rustlers, Mary Stanton drowned in a creek she had crossed safely 1,000 times before, each death occurring within a month of the victim refusing to sell their land to Silas Pendleton. Each property acquired by Pendleton within weeks of the owner's convenient demise. 14 people. Eliza said, her voice steady despite the horror crawling up her spine. He murdered 14 people. 15, Gideon said. Harlan makes 15. The ledger sat on the barn floor between them, a dead man's testimony written in ink and preserved in a metal box and carried through a burning house by a man who had never been good with words, but understood that some things are worth bleeding for. We take this to Helena, Eliza said. Marshal Redford. 5 days on horseback, Boone said, through mountain passes. Silas will know we are gone. He will send men to cut us off, Wamos. Then we go away he does not expect. Callum, north trail through the high passes. Harder, longer, but nobody uses it. Gideon looked at Eliza. His eyes held something that was not cold and not warm, but honest, the way steel is honest, showing you exactly what it is without pretense. You know, if we go to the marshal's office, they might arrest me. My record is old, but it exists. I know. And you still want to go, do you? The question is not what I want. The question is whether you trust me to come back to you. Eliza looked at this man, this scarred and silent and impossible man who fixed fences at dawn and walked perimeters at midnight and broke his own ribs, catching her because letting her fall then was something his body simply refused to do. I trust you, she said. Then we go. The night before they left, Eliza could not sleep. She went outside and found Gideon on the barn steps, a knife in his hand, a piece of wood in his lap, not whittling for purpose. Whittling because his hands needed occupation the way his lungs needed air. She sat beside him. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full the way a river is full, carrying things beneath its surface that only someone paying attention could see. Gideon, yes, if something bad happens in Helena, if they arrest you, then you will be fine. Boone and Callum will stay. The ranch will stand. I'm not talking about the ranch. She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight his face was all shadow and angle and scar, and she thought he was the most honest thing she had ever seen, because his face hid nothing while pretending to hide everything. I will not be fine without you. The knife stopped. Gideon looked at her. In the mountain darkness, his eyes held a warmth that came from somewhere deeper than reflection. You know what I am. I know who you are. There is a difference. I have killed men. You have saved people. Your brothers. Me. You saved us. You deserve better than. Do not tell me what I deserve. Her voice carried an edge, the Boston steel that Boone had recognized before anyone else. I grew up in an orphanage where they told me every day what I deserved. One meal, one corner of a bed, a job where the master thought he had rights to my body. I have chosen for myself since the day I boarded that stagecoach for Montana. And I choose you. Silence. Wind in the pines. The distant sound of the creek running cold and constant over stone. Gideon set the knife down. He raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, the way a man moves who has learned that hands can hurt and wants to make certain his never will. His calloused fingers touched her cheek, rough skin against smooth. The hands of a man who had built and broken and rebuilt, touching her face with a tenderness so careful it was almost unbearable. You are safe with me, he whispered. Whatever happens, always. He lowered his hand before the moment became too large for either of them to hold. He stood. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is a long day. Eliza sat alone in the moonlight. Silver light poured over the valley, over the ashes of the house that had been over the barn that held 3 brothers in a metal box full of a dead man's truth. And she thought I came to Montana to find a home. I found 4. Above her, the stars burned cold and close, the way they only burn in high country, and the wind carried the smell of pine and ash and the first green things of spring, pushing through frozen ground. And somewhere in the barn, Gideon Mercer lay in the dark, thinking about a woman who had said, I choose you, to a man who had never been chosen for anything except blame. And that night in the mountains of Montana, two people who had been alone their entire lives began to understand that alone was no longer a word that applied to them. Whatever came next, they would face it together, the way it was always supposed to be. They left at first light on four horses that had no business making a 5-day journey through mountain passes still choked with late-season snow. But the horses were strong. The way everything connected to the Mercer brothers was strong through stubbornness and survival, and the refusal to quit when quitting was the sensible choice. Eliza rode a chestnut mare that Callum had gentled over the past weeks, talking to the animal in low, steady tones. The way he talked to everything that was frightened with patience and the unspoken promise that no harm would come. She wore riding pants that had belonged to Harlan Colton, cinched at the waist with a belt she had punched new holes in, and one of his old canvas shirts with the sleeves rolled past her wrists. The white silk dress was gone but burned with the house. She did not miss it. The woman who had worn that dress, the trembling mail-order bride stepping off a stagecoach into a town that wanted her gone, felt like someone she had read about in a book, rather than someone she had been. Harlan's documents rode in the saddlebag on Gideon's horse, wrapped in oilcloth against moisture, tied with leather cord, protected with the same care a soldier gives to orders that will determine whether a battle is won or lost. Because that is what this was, a battle. Fought not with guns, though guns would come into it before the end, but with paper and ink and the testimony of a dead man who had known he was going to die and had spent his last weeks making sure his death would mean something. Gideon rode point, his broken ribs wrapped tight under his shirt, breathing shallow to keep the damaged bones from grating. He had not complained and would not. Boone rode the left flank, positioned between Eliza and the western tree line, his gaze sweeping the landscape in constant, restless arcs, yet cataloging terrain the way a general catalogs a battlefield. His face still bore faint pink lines from the glass cuts, and his hands were bandaged where the flames had licked his skin, but he rode with the easy competence of someone for whom pain was a condition of living rather than an interruption to it. Callum rode closest to Eliza, his herb pack on his back, his rifle in a scabbard on his saddle, scanning the trail ahead with the knowledge of these mountains that his brothers respected and the rest of the world did not know existed. North Trail, Callum said, guiding them onto a path so narrow and overgrown that Eliza would have ridden past it without noticing. Nobody uses it because nobody knows it is here. Old Trapper wrote from before the miners came. Adds a day to the journey, but no one will follow. You are certain, Gideon asked. I am certain nobody from Elkhorn Ridge knows this trail. I am less certain about the snow in the high pass. If it has not melted enough, we will have to dig through or go around. We dig through, Boone said. Going around adds 2 days. 2 days is 2 days Silas uses to build his defense. They rode single file through old-growth pine forests where the canopy blocked the sky and the trail felt like a tunnel carved through living wood. The air smelled of resin and snowmelt. They camped the first night in a hollow below the tree line, sheltered from wind by a granite outcropping. No fire, cold food, jerky and hardtack that tasted of nothing but served the purpose of filling a stomach that needed fuel for tomorrow's climb. The brothers settled into their nighttime positions with the practiced ease of men who had been sleeping in the wilderness their entire lives. Callum took first watch. Boone laid out his bedroll near the horses' guns within arm's reach. Gideon placed his bedroll beside Eliza's close, but not touching, maintaining the careful distance he always kept. You should sleep, he said quietly. I know. But you will not. Not yet. Silence. The wind moved through the pines above them with a sound like the mountain breathing. Are you afraid? Eliza asked. Of Silas, no. Of Helena, of what happens when we get there. Gideon was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, voice he used when he was saying something true rather than something useful. I am afraid of cages. I have lived free my entire life, even when free meant hunted and cold and hungry. The idea of walls that do not open, of doors someone else controls, that is the thing that comes for me in the dark when I cannot sleep. Then why are you doing this? Why turn yourself in? Because I want to deserve the life I am building. I want to wake up beside. He stopped. Started again choosing different words, though Eliza heard the ones he had almost said and held them like a lantern in the dark. I want to build something that is not founded on running. If I keep running, Silas always has a weapon. They will say the evidence came from a criminal household. They will say my word is worthless. Turning myself in, facing what I have done, that takes the weapon away. And if they hang you, then you will have the ranch and the water rights and Boone and Callum to protect you. And Silas will be in prison and you will be safe. That is enough. It is not enough. Eliza's voice carried an edge that cut through the mountain air. You do not get to decide that your life is an acceptable trade for my safety. I did not marry you so you could die for me. I married you so we could live together. In the darkness, she felt rather than saw him turn toward her. And then his hand found hers rough palm against smooth calloused fingers threading between slender ones, and he held on with a grip that was firm and gentle and said everything his voice could not. I am not planning to die, he said. Good, because I am not planning to let you. On the second day, Gideon found tracks. Boot prints and soft ground horse droppings still warm the bent grass that tells a tracker someone has passed this way recently and is not far ahead. He held up his fist, and the column stopped, 4 riders frozen in the green silence of the forest listening. We are being followed, he said. At least 5 riders, maybe more. Coming from the southeast, they know the general direction we are heading, even if they do not know this specific trail. How far behind? Boone asked, and there was something almost eager in his voice, the way a hunting dog's ears prick forward when it catches a scent. Half a day, maybe less if they push their horses. Then we push ours, Eliza said. We do not stop until we have to. They rode hard through the second day, pushing the horses as far as the animals could go. Callum led them through shortcuts only he knew, scrambling up creek beds and across ridge lines invisible to anyone without his knowledge of the terrain. By nightfall, they had gained ground, but not enough. The trackers were still behind them. The third day brought them to Eagle Pass. It was a narrow defile cut through solid granite by 10,000 years of snowmelt and erosion. A slot canyon barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast, with walls that rose 40 feet on either side, like the pages of a book standing on edge. The trail ran through the center, flat and sandy, with scattered boulders that had fallen from the walls over centuries, creating a corridor of natural cover that was perfect for travel and equally perfect for ambush. Gideon stopped at the entrance and studied the pass the way a man reads a contract he knows contains a trap. His eyes moved from the walls to the boulders to the far end, where the canyon opened into a meadow, and his expression shifted from caution to certainty. They are in there, he said. How do you know? Eliza asked. Because it is where I would be. Boone smiled. The dangerous smile, the one that showed teeth and reached his eyes, and meant that some part of him, some deep and primal part that he kept chained most of the time, was glad for what was about to happen. How many? At least 7 based on the tracks. They came in from the south entrance and set up positions along the walls. High ground cover, crossfire angles. Professional work. Greaves, Eliza said. Silas sent Dalton Greaves. Probably. Greaves is a soldier. He knows how to set an ambush. So what do we do? Go around when? Going around adds 2 days, Boone said. 2 days we do not have. Going through means riding into a kill box, Callum said. Eliza looked at the canyon. She looked at the walls, the boulders, the narrow passage that could become a grave for 4 people and 4 horses. She thought about Harlan's letters in the saddlebag, about 14 names in a ledger, about a man who had written, I am writing this, so you will know it was not an accident, and then died the way he predicted, violently and alone. We go through, she said, but not the way they expect. 3 pairs of eyes turned to her. 3 brothers, each accustomed to being the one with the plan, looking at a 21-year-old woman from Boston who had never fired a gun before 3 weeks ago and who was now proposing a strategy for surviving an ambush in a canyon she had never seen before today. I am listening, Gideon said. Callum and I go through the center. We make noise, we draw their attention. We make them think we are the only targets. She held up a hand before any of them could interrupt. While they are focused on us, you and Boone climb the walls. Gideon takes the left. Boone takes the right. You come at them from above and behind. You want to use yourself as bait, Gideon said. His voice was flat, which meant he was furious, which meant she was probably right. I want to use mathematics. 7 men looking in one direction are vulnerable from 2 other directions. That is not bravery. It is geometry. Boone laughed. A real laugh, sudden and sharp, the first genuine sound of amusement Eliza had heard from him since the night she had sat beside him on the porch steps while his brother burned with fever. "I like her plan," he said to Gideon. "I like her. I have never said that out loud before. I am saying it now. Listen to her." Gideon looked at Boone, looked at Eliza, looked at the canyon. His jaw worked the way it worked when he was fighting with himself, the careful tactician wrestling the man who wanted to wrap Eliza in armor and hide her somewhere no bullet could reach. "If anything happens to you in there," he said to Eliza, and his voice was quiet and rough and final, "I will burn this entire territory to the ground. Nothing is going to happen to me because you will be on that wall making sure it does not." They moved. Gideon went left, scaling the canyon wall with the silent efficiency of a man who had grown up climbing mountains. His broken ribs slowed him. Eliza could see the careful way he pulled himself up, the pauses when the pain caught and held before releasing. But he did not stop, and he did not make a sound. Within minutes, he had disappeared into the rocks above a shadow among shadows, a ghost with a gun, and a debt to a dead man that he intended to pay in full. Boone went right, climbing with a speed that bordered on reckless, his bandaged hands gripping stone with the strength of a man who trusted his body the way he trusted his guns, absolutely and without reservation. He reached his position in half the time Gideon took, because Boone Mercer did everything at a speed that suggested he was racing against something only he could see. Callum rode beside Eliza into the mouth of the canyon. His face was calm, but his hands held the reins with a tension that betrayed the calm, and his rifle was out of its scabbard and laid across his saddle. "If shooting starts," he said, "get off the horse and get behind the biggest rock you can find. Do not stand up until I tell you." "Callum." "Yes." "Do not die." He smiled, that warm Callum smile that had been the first thing to make Eliza feel safe in Montana. "I am not planning on it." They were halfway through the pass when the voice came from above. "Mercer, we know you are down there. Hand over the papers and the woman, and you can ride out. Dalton Greaves." His voice echoed off the canyon walls, multiplied and distorted, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Eliza could not see him, but she could feel his eyes on her, the way prey feels the predator's gaze. "That you, Greaves?" Callum called back, his voice easy, conversational, as though they had run into each other at the general store. "How much is Silas paying you?" "Has to be a lot to make you this foolish." "Enough. Now hand over the documents." "What documents?" Callum said, feigning confusion so convincingly that Eliza almost believed him. "We are just out for a ride. Beautiful country up here. You should see the wildflowers in the meadow just past the—" A gunshot cracked the air. The bullet hit the rock 3 feet to Eliza's left, sending up a spray of stone chips that stung her cheek. Her horse reared, and she gripped the reins and forced the animal down and back under control, her heart slamming against her ribs, but her hands, she noticed with distant surprise, not shaking at all. "Next one is not a warning," Greaves shouted. "Well, that is rude," Callum said. "Then lower to Eliza. Get down, now." They dismounted in a single coordinated motion, dropping behind the nearest boulder as gunfire erupted from both canyon walls. Bullets cracked against stone, ricocheted off granite, kicked up dust. The horses bolted forward through the canyon, wild-eyed and terrified, and Eliza let them go because a spooked horse was a moving target that would draw attention and draw fire, and every bullet aimed at a running horse was a bullet not aimed at her. Behind the boulder, she pressed against Callum's side and felt the rapid thud of his heartbeat through his shirt. He was scared. They were both scared. But he raised his rifle over the top of the boulder and fired 2 shots not aimed at anyone, aimed at the canyon wall above the position where the shots had originated, and the sound was enormous in the confined space, bouncing off the walls like thunder trapped in a box. "Shoot high," Eliza said, and she raised Harlan's rifle and fired at the rocks above a second cluster of men, and stone chips exploded and rained down, and somewhere up there a man cursed and ducked. "Make it sound like there are more of us." They fired in a pattern, alternating shots aiming at stone rather than flesh, filling the canyon with noise and ricochets and confusion. And on the walls above, moving through the rocks like wolves through underbrush, Gideon and Boone went to work. Eliza did not see what happened on the canyon walls. She did not need to. She heard it. The sound of a man grunting in surprise as someone came at him from behind. The crack of a gun butt against a skull. A short scream cut off by a fist. The clatter of a weapon dropping onto stone. Then silence from one position. Then another. Gideon worked the left wall, methodical, precise disabling rather than killing, using his fists and the butt of his pistol with the controlled violence of a man who knew exactly how much force was required to end consciousness without ending life. His broken ribs screamed with every impact. Eliza knew. This the way she knew the sun would set. But he did not stop, and he did not falter, and he did not make a sound that would reveal his position. Boone worked the right wall. He was faster than Gideon, less precise, more forceful, a thunderstorm compared to Gideon's earthquake. Where Gideon disabled with calculated strikes, Boone overwhelmed with speed and aggression, appearing behind men, like a specter and ending the confrontation before it could become a fight. 3 men on the right wall went down in under 2 minutes, none dead, all unable to stand, and Boone moved through them like wind through wheat. The firing from above stopped. One by one the positions fell silent. And then Dalton Greaves' voice rang out, no longer commanding, but uncertain, the voice of a man whose ambush has become his trap. "What the hell is happening up there?" "Your boys just got smart," Boone called from the right wall, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who has just done the thing he is best at in the world. "You should try it." Silence, then the sound of boots on stone moving fast, moving away. Greaves and the 2 men who still had functioning legs were running, scrambling down the far side of the canyon wall, heading for their horses. "Let them go," Gideon said, appearing at the top of the left wall, silhouetted against the sky. His voice was tight with pain and control. "Let Greaves go back to Silas. Let him tell Silas what happened. Let Silas know we are coming." Callum helped Eliza to her feet. Her legs shook. Her ears rang from the gunfire. Her cheek bled where the stone chips had cut it. But she was standing, and she was alive, and the documents were intact. Gideon descended the wall and crossed the canyon floor to her. He moved stiffly, his broken ribs punishing him for every strike he had thrown, but his eyes found hers and held them with something she had not seen there before. Pride. "You did good," Boone said, dropping down from the right wall. His knuckles were raw, his eyes bright. "That trick with the ricochet shots. Smart. I did not want to kill anyone. I know, that is what makes it smart. Killing is easy. Not killing when you have the right to, that takes something most people do not have." They collected the horses, tied up Greaves' abandoned men with their own belts, and rode on toward Helena. They arrived 5 days after leaving the ranch, riding into Helena on exhausted horses covered in trail dust, in the particular kind of weariness that settles into the soul. The marshal's office sat on the main street, a stone building with barred windows. Marshal Everett Redford sat behind a desk covered in papers, a man of 58 with silver hair and eyes that had seen so many lies. They had developed a permanent squint of skepticism. When the door opened and 4 people walked in, his hand went to his gun. Gideon Mercer. The name came out flat with but surprise, the way a man says a word he has been expecting to hear for a long time. "Never thought you would walk into my office voluntarily." "Marshal Redford, I am here to turn myself in." "Is that so?" "After you hear what my wife has to say." Redford's eyebrows rose. He looked at Eliza, at the riding pants and canvas shirt, and the bruise on her cheekbone, and the rifle she carried like a woman who had learned what it was for. Then at Boone with his 2 guns and his bandaged hands and his expression that said, "I am cooperating, but I am also keeping count of exits." Then at Callum, who stood slightly behind the others, calm and watchful, his herb pack on his back, like a doctor arriving at a field hospital. "Your wife," Redford repeated. "Eliza Mercer," Eliza said, stepping forward and laying Harlan's documents on the desk. "Formerly Eliza Winslow, I have something you need to see." She spread the letters across his desk. She opened the ledger. She spoke for 20 minutes without stopping, laying out the pattern of death and acquisition that Harlan Colton had documented with the precision of a man who knew he was writing his own obituary. 14 names, 14 deaths, 14 properties acquired by Silas Pendleton within weeks of their owner's convenient demise. The water rights, the underground spring, the systematic strangulation of every independent rancher in the county. Redford read, his face darkened like a sky before a storm, the lines around his eyes deepening, his mouth thinning to a line. When he finished the last letter, he set it down carefully, the way a man sets down something explosive. "This is serious." "It is the truth," Eliza said. "My first husband documented everything before Silas had him killed. Every threat, every suspicious death, every piece of the pattern. First husband, Redford looked at Gideon. How many have you got? Just the one, partner, Gideon said. Harlan Colton was the man she was supposed to marry. He died before she arrived. I married her to keep Silas from stealing her land. Now I am standing in your office telling you that the man who killed Harlan Colton has killed 14 other people, and I am asking you to arrest him. And then arrest you. And then arrest me for whatever charges are still on my record. I will face them, but Silas first. Justice for the dead before justice for the living. Redford stood, walked to the window. Stood there for a long time looking out at the street where people walked and horses pulled wagons. And life went on the way life does, indifferent to the weight of what was being decided in a small stone office. I am sending deputies to Elkhorn Ridge tonight, he said. If Pendleton's there, they will bring him in. If he has run, we track him. He turned to Gideon. You are not under arrest, not yet. Call it protective custody. You stay in Helena until this is resolved. All four of you. Understood. And Mercer. Redford's eyes held Gideon's. I knew your mother, Sarah Mercer. She taught Sunday school at the church in Copper Creek before she moved up the mountain. She was a good woman. Yes, sir, she was. What happened to her was a crime that nobody answered for. What you did about it was what any man would have done, and the fact that you were 15 years old and used your father's axe to do it does not make you a criminal. It makes you a son who loved his mother. That is what I will tell the judge when your time comes. Gideon said nothing, but his jaw worked and his eyes went bright for just a second before the granite slid back into place. They stayed at a boarding house in Helena, clean rooms, hot water food that someone else had cooked. That evening, Eliza found Gideon sitting on the boarding house porch watching the sunset paint Helena in shades of gold and rust. You could hang, she said, sitting beside him. Not gently, not easing into it. She said it the way she said everything now, directly, because they had moved past the stage where truth needed softening. I know. And you turned yourself in because you want to deserve building a life with me. He looked at her. You listened that night, on the barn steps. Every word. Then you know. I know you are the best man I have ever met, and the world has spent 21 years telling you otherwise, and I am tired of the world being wrong about you. Gideon reached for her hand, not tentatively, not slowly. He reached for it the way a man reaches for a rope when he is drowning with certainty and need. His calloused fingers closed around hers and held. When this is over, he said, when the trial is done and Silas is in prison and whatever happens to me has happened, will you still be there? Where else would I be? You could go back east, start over, marry someone without a record and a reputation that precedes him into every room. I could, I will not. Why here? Because you fix fences at dawn and walk perimeters at midnight, and you caught me when I jumped from a burning house, and you did not let go even when your ribs broke. Because you are honest about what you have done and brave about what it wanted, and because when you look at me, I feel like the person I was always supposed to be. That is why. He kissed her. Not the way she had imagined a first kiss would be, not gentle or tentative or sweet. He kissed her the way a man kisses a woman when he has been holding himself back for weeks, and the holding has cost him more than the broken ribs and the canyon fight and the 21 years of loneliness combined. He cupped her face in his hands, those rough, scarred hands that had built and broken and rebuilt, and he kissed her with a tenderness that made the roughness irrelevant. When they parted, foreheads touching both, breathing hard, Eliza said, "For a man everyone calls dangerous, you kiss remarkably gently." And Gideon Mercer smiled. Not the ghost of a smile, not the suggestion of a smile, not the place where a smile would be if he remembered how. A real smile, small and startled and radiant, like the first light of morning breaking over a mountain that has been in shadow for years. Silas Pendleton was captured 6 days later in Butte at the home of Judge Nathaniel Whitfield, a former subordinate from his Army days. Redford's deputies had ridden hard, and Eliza's prediction proved correct. Silas had not fled to Mexico. He had gone to an ally to a man who owed him loyalty from the war years, intending to build a legal defense that would turn the accusations back on his accusers. Eliza had known. She had understood Silas the way you understand weather once you have lived through enough storms. He was not a man who ran. He was a man who regrouped. When they brought him into the marshal's office in chains, Silas looked at Eliza with an expression she had not expected. Not rage, not defiance, exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of a man whose campaign has finally exceeded his resources. You want to know why, he said, and his voice was different now. Stripped of the colonel's authority, stripped of the land, Baron's confidence reduced to something human and tired. After the war, I commanded 200 men. We held a line at Antietam that should not have held. Men died because I told them to stand, and they stood. And we won. Then the war ended, and I came home, and nobody needed me. No troops, no orders, no purpose. This land, this territory, I built it because I needed something to build. The people who refused to sell, they were not enemies. They were obstacles, and in war you remove obstacles. They were people, Eliza said. 14 people with families and names and lives that mattered. I know. Silas closed his eyes. I have known for a long time. He did not resist when they led him away. He walked out of the marshal's office and into the Helena jail with the straight back and measured stride of a man who has finally encountered an enemy he cannot outmaneuver, which was the weight of what he had done. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Eliza testified, first reading Harlan's letters into the record with a steady voice and dry eyes, letting the dead man's words do the work that emotion could not. Gideon testified about the attack on the ranch and fire the ambush in Eagle Pass with the flat, factual delivery of a man who does not embellish because the truth is sufficient. Boone and Callum each took the stand in turn, Boone's account so precise the jury leaned forward to catch every word, Callum's testimony about Harlan so genuine that 2 jurors wiped their eyes. 14 families took the stand. Wives who had lost husbands, children who had lost fathers. Each one a thread in the tapestry of suffering that Silas Pendleton had woven across 3 years in 30 miles of Montana territory. On the 4th week, the verdict came. Guilty. Counts. 14 counts of murder, conspiracy, land fraud, arson, corruption of public officials. Judge Harwick of Elkhorn Ridge called as a witness, broke down on the stand, and confessed his complicity and was subsequently removed from his position and charged separately. Silas Pendleton received a sentence of life imprisonment at hard labor in the territorial prison. He stood when the sentence was read and said nothing. He did not look at Eliza. He did not look at anyone. He looked at the wall behind the judge, as though he could see through it to the mountains beyond the empire he had built and the graves he had filled to build it. Justice, as it turned out, was quieter than Eliza had expected. Not triumphant, not cathartic, quiet. The quiet of a wound that has been cleaned and sutured and will take years to heal, but will eventually become a scar rather than an open gash. And then it was Gideon's turn. The courtroom was smaller for this trial. Different judge, Judge Catherine Ainsley, 50 years old with silver hair pulled back in a severe knot and eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. She was known throughout the territory as fair and unforgiving, a woman who had fought to be taken seriously in a profession that considered her gender a disqualification and who had won that fight through competence, so undeniable that even the men who resented her could not argue with her record. Gideon Mercer, she said, and her voice filled the courtroom the way a church bell fills a valley. You stand charged with assault, destruction of property, and evading arrest. Multiple counts spanning 2 territories. How do you plead? Guilty, Your Honor, to all of it. I did those things. I am not here to deny what I have done. Marshal Redford stood. Your Honor, if I may speak on behalf of the defendant. Proceed, Marshal. I have been a lawman for 30 years. I know the difference between a man who claims he has changed and a man who has. Gideon Mercer turned himself in voluntarily, knowing the likely consequences. He provided testimony instrumental in convicting a mass murderer. He protected a woman from corruption at risk to his own life multiple times without expectation of reward. And he did all of this while carrying the weight of a reputation earned at 15 years old when he killed 3 men who had just murdered his mother. Redford paused. I knew Sarah Mercer. She was a good woman. Her son deserved better than 21 years of being called a monster for doing what any son would do. Gideon Mercer has reformed, not as a strategy, as a man who decided he wanted to be worthy of the people who love him. That kind of change is rare. It deserves recognition. Judge Ainsley turned to Eliza. Mrs. Mercer, do you wish to address the court? Eliza stood. She wore a simple dress borrowed from the boarding house owner, Her hair braided her face clean of everything except the truth she was about to speak. Your Honor, when I came to Montana, I was alone. No family, no money, no one in the world who knew my name. The man everyone told me to fear walked into a courtroom and gave me a home. He fixed fences before dawn. He walked the perimeter every night. He caught me when I jumped from a burning house and held on while his own ribs broke. He walked into this office knowing he might never walk out because he believed my freedom was worth more than his. She paused. Her voice carried the weight of everything she had survived and everything she had found. I am not asking for mercy. I am asking for justice. A man willing to face the consequences of his past to give someone else a future is not the man he used to be. He is the man he chose to become. Give him the chance to keep becoming. Judge Ainsley was silent for a long time. She looked at Gideon standing straight despite the ribs that still ached, his eyes steady, his hands at his sides, neither begging nor defiant. A man waiting for a verdict he had earned one way or another. Mr. Mercer, your record is extensive. Under ordinary circumstances, you would face significant prison time. But these are not ordinary circumstances. She leaned forward. 5 years supervised release. You will remain in Montana territory. You will report monthly to Marshal Redford. You will perform community service as directed by this court. Any violation results in immediate imprisonment. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. Furthermore, charges in other territories will be dropped upon successful completion of your supervised release. You are receiving a second chance, Mr. Mercer. I suggest you spend every day of it building the life your mother wanted you to have. I will, Your Honor. Do not thank me. Thank the woman who stood in this courtroom and spoke for you when the world would not. Now get out of my court and go home. They walked out of the courthouse into late afternoon sunlight that fell across Helena like a benediction. Eliza took Gideon's hand and he took hers, and they stood on the courthouse steps and breathed air that tasted like freedom, which is to say it tasted like pine and dust and the particular sweetness of a future that has been fought for and won. Callum appeared beside them and put his arms around both of them. His eyes bright with tears he did not hide because Callum had never seen the point in hiding what he felt. We did it, he said. We actually did it. Boone stood apart the way Boone always stood apart, hands in his pockets, jaw-tight eyes fixed on the middle distance. Eliza reached for him, took his hand, pulled him toward the others. He resisted for 1 second, 2. Then he let her pull him in, and for a moment on the steps of a courthouse in Helena, Montana, in the golden light of an afternoon that neither of them had been certain they would live to see, 4 people held each other and did not let go. They returned to Elkhorn Ridge 3 days later and stood before the ashes of the house that had been, and Eliza said, we build here, higher ground, better view of the valley. And they built, and they built. Gideon built the frame with mortise and tenon joints fitted so precisely they would hold without nails. Boone raised the walls with a force that made the ground shake. Callum did the finish work and carved a sign for above the front door that read, Mercer, in letters that were steady and clean and permanent. Neighbors came to help the ranchers who had nearly lost everything to Silas Pendleton, bringing lumber and nails and food and the particular kind of gratitude that expresses itself through labor. The house rose from the ashes through spring and into summer, and the sound of hammers rang across the valley like a heartbeat returning to a body that had been still too long. The house was finished by late August. 4 bedrooms. A kitchen large enough for a table that seated 6. A porch that wrapped around 2 sides and faced east to catch the sunrise and west to catch the sunset because Eliza had decided that a house should greet the day from both directions. The town changed, slowly the way a river changes its course. People saw Callum treating sick children with his herbs charging nothing. They saw Boone teaching Tommy Evershaw, a 16-year-old orphan he had taken on as a ranch hand, how to ride and stand straight and look a man in the eye. They saw Gideon helping neighbors rebuild fences and barns. The whispers faded. Not all at once, but enough people looked past the stories to see the truth. 3 brothers who had been broken by violence and loneliness, and a woman from Boston who had seen not what they had been, but what they could become. One evening in September, Eliza sat on the new porch with Gideon beside her, watching the sun go down behind the mountains. The air smelled of cut wood and the last flowers of summer, and the clean, cold water of the creek that ran through their property, the water that Silas Pendleton had killed for and that now belonged to a family that would never sell it. Harlan would not believe this, Eliza said. Harlan would be proud, Gideon said. He wanted this land to live. It is living. He wrote to me that he needed a woman of courage who does not fear labor or solitude. I wonder what he would think of what I found instead. What did you find? Eliza looked at him. At the scar and the steady gaze in the jaw that had been clenched for 21 years and was only now slowly learning to relax. At the hands that rested on his knees open and quiet, no longer fisted against a world that had given him nothing but reasons to fight. I found you, she said. He kissed her then on the porch he had built in the last light of a day that had been ordinary and therefore precious. His hand came up to her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone, and Eliza closed her eyes and leaned into his touch and felt the word home settle into her body like warmth from a fire that would never go out. A year later, Eliza stood on that same porch, her hand resting on the swell of her belly, and watched three brothers at their work. Gideon at the fence line, always at the fence line, because fences were his language, and every post he set was a sentence in a letter to the future that said someone was here and someone cared and someone built this to last. Boone in the corral with Tommy Evershaw teaching the boy to rope with a patience that nobody who knew the old Boone would have believed possible, his voice carrying across the yard in short, clear instructions that somehow conveyed both expectation and encouragement. Callum in his garden, which had grown 3 times its original size, his hands in the earth surrounded by the living things he had coaxed out of Montana soil with knowledge his mother had given him and skill he had spent a lifetime developing. Gideon looked up, saw her, smiled. The smile was no longer rare. It was still small, still quiet, still the smile of a man who had forgotten how and was relearning. But it came more easily now, and it reached his eyes, and it was real. The baby came that winter on a night when snow fell so thick and silent that the world outside the windows disappeared, and the only things that existed were warmth and light and the sound of a child taking her first breath. A girl, small and perfect and furious, screaming with the lungs of someone who intended to be heard, with her father's warm coloring and her mother's golden hair, and a grip when Gideon put his finger in her tiny fist that made him stare at his hand as though he had never seen it before. Gideon held his daughter. This man whose hands had killed and built and caught a woman falling from a burning house held this small creature with a tenderness so enormous it did not fit in the room. His face held an expression Eliza had never seen: wonder and terror and love tangled together so tightly they were indistinguishable. And when he looked up at Eliza, his eyes were bright and full, and he did not try to hide it. Boone stood by the door. He did not hold the baby. He was not ready for that. But he stood closer than his usual distance, and when the baby cried, he did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He began to sing, softly, under his breath, an old song slightly off-key. Barbara Allen, the laundry song, the song his mother used to sing while she washed clothes on a Montana mountain 21 years ago. He sang it wrong the same way his mother had, and the baby quieted, and Callum, sitting in the corner with tears running down his face that he made no effort to stop, said, "Mama would have loved her." "Yes," Gideon said, "she would have." Eliza looked at her family, the family nobody thought could exist, an orphan from Boston, 3 brothers from a mountain, a baby born in a house built from ashes, and Tommy Evershaw asleep in the next room, the boy Boone had taken in without ever saying the words, but who followed him everywhere, and who had started when he thought no one was listening, calling Boone sir in the way a son calls his father. She thought about Harlan Colton, who had written to a stranger and asked her to be brave. She thought about Sarah Mercer, who had taught her sons that a man's worth is measured not by what he takes from the world, but what he builds in it. She thought about 14 people whose names were in a ledger and whose deaths had finally been answered. And she thought about the girl she had been 1 year ago, standing in the dust of Elkhorn Ridge with a worn valise and a folded letter and nothing else in the world. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had walked through fire and gunfights and courtrooms, in the slow, terrifying process of learning to trust 3 men the world called monsters, and who had discovered that dangerous and monstrous are not the same word, and the difference between them is everything. The snow fell, the fire crackled, Gideon held his daughter, Boone sang his mother's song, Callum wept without shame, and Eliza Mercer, born Winslow, born nobody, born into a world that had given her nothing and expected even less, stood in the home she had built with the family she had chosen, and knew, with the certainty of someone who has earned every scrap of her happiness, that this was where she was always meant to be. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is believe. Believe that people can change. Believe that redemption is a choice you make every morning when you get up and fix the fences and walk the perimeter and hold the people you love a little tighter than you did the day before. And believe that a girl from an orphanage who had nothing could travel 2,000 miles on the strength of a dead man's letter and find at the end of the road not just a home, but the people who make a home worth building. The snow kept falling, the mountains stood watch, and inside a cabin built from ashes and stubbornness and love, a family that should not have existed held each other close, and the night was long, and the fire was warm, and nobody was alone.